Everyone thought this story was about controversy and online reactions, but what if I told you the real battle has been happening quietly behind closed doors? In filings, denials, motion after motion, and alliances that may have shifted everything. And tonight we break down the one connection that could change the entire outcome, and why the next ruling could rewrite everything you think you know about this case. What most people saw online looked like noise. Reactions, edits, opinions, and emotional reactions moving faster than facts. But what was happening quietly underneath that surface was something far more structured, far more calculated, and far more consequential. Because while the public conversation stayed locked on personal reactions, the procedural reality began closing doors, one by one. And those doors, once closed, do not reopen easily. And what makes this situation so intense is not what is being said out loud, but what has already been decided in silence, through rules, timelines, permissions, and limits that cannot be pressured into changing. And this is where the tension quietly deepened, because expectations and legal reality rarely move at the same speed. And the moment those speeds diverge, the outcome becomes far less negotiable and far more predetermined. And what looked like confidence began to resemble overextension, and what once felt like control began to look like exposure. Because momentum in public opinion does not guarantee momentum in formal proceedings. And the more the strategy leaned on urgency, the more the structure leaned on restraint. And that friction is where consequences are born. And this story is no longer driven by statements. It is driven by procedure. And once the frame shifts from narrative to process, every misstep carries permanent weight. And nothing demonstrates that shift more than when attempts to access information encounter formal resistance. Because resistance in that environment is not emotional, it is procedural. And when permission is required but not granted, the denial speaks louder than any argument. And from that point forward, each attempted expansion of reach becomes a record of limitation, and the record itself becomes part of the story whether anyone wants it to or not. And the deeper this moves, the more alignment begins to matter, not just today, but retroactively, because once two paths intertwine, separation becomes costly, and strategy becomes constrained by past decisions that can no longer be undone. And this is where the quiet danger builds, because when coordination becomes visible, when timing overlaps, when filings mirror one another, and when goals align too closely, what once felt like partnership begins to resemble shared exposure. And shared exposure multiplies risk rather than disperses it. And that multiplication becomes impossible to reverse once the system begins tracing patterns instead of evaluating individual motions. And this is exactly where the shift happened, when repetition replaced novelty, and when urgency replaced justification, and when denial replaced persuasion. And as those conditions stacked, the margin for flexibility narrowed until it all became a question of endurance rather than persuasion. And endurance in this space is not measured by attention, but by sustainability. And sustainability depends on structural compliance, not volume. And that is why the atmosphere feels so tense now, because the tools once used to accelerate advantage have begun accelerating consequence. And when consequence starts catching up, it does not move slowly, it moves all at once. And this creates a paradox where every attempt to push forward increases the gravity pulling backward. And the harder the push, the stronger that gravity becomes. And once gravity exceeds momentum, collapse becomes inevitable. Not emotional collapse, but structural collapse where options disappear, not because they were rejected loudly, but because they expired quietly. And expiration cannot be argued with. And this is the phase the situation has entered now, where expiration begins replacing opportunity, and where requests encounter thresholds that have already passed. And once that happens, context no longer matters, only timing matters, and timing has no sympathy. And this is why the narrative so many people believe is no longer the narrative that governs the outcome, because belief does not alter calendars, and calendars do not consider emotion. And in that mechanical reality, alignment becomes the most dangerous variable, because alignment ties destinies together, and once tied, disentanglement becomes damage, not relief. And as these ties tighten, the ability for any one party to pivot away shrinks rapidly until pivot itself becomes additional evidence of instability. And instability amplifies scrutiny. And scrutiny thrives on documentation. And documentation is what preserves patterns long after statements fade. And that is where the loop closes, because the very attempt to accelerate resolution through volume ends up engraving the story deeper into record, and that record becomes the final narrator, regardless of who speaks last. And this is the moment where everything slows on the surface, but accelerates underneath. And viewers feel that shift, even if they cannot articulate it, because the tension is no longer reactive. It is anticipatory. And anticipation is always heavier than reaction, because reaction releases pressure, while anticipation traps it. And the pressure has been building quietly for a very long time, and now it has nowhere left to expand. And when pressure has nowhere to go, it condenses. And condensed pressure always eventually finds a release point. And the entire trajectory now revolves around where that release will occur and who will be standing closest when it happens. And that question remains unanswered, but the direction it is moving is no longer ambiguous. And this is only the first layer of what that means. As the pressure continues to condense, the environment shifts in ways that are invisible to most observers, because what once felt like motion now feels like weight, and weight changes behavior more than momentum ever could. And this is where decision-making narrows, because options that once appeared open no longer feel reachable. And that narrowing creates urgency, which then feeds directly back into exposure, because urgency amplifies visibility, and visibility attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny never arrives alone. It arrives with documentation, timelines, and cross-reference. And where once actions could pass quietly, now they resonate loudly through records. And this resonance changes the tone of everything, because now each move is no longer evaluated as isolated, but as part of a developing pattern, and pattern recognition is far more powerful than any individual statement, where strategy often begins to unravel, because patterns speak, even when individuals fall silent. And silence in this stage does not pause interpretation, it intensifies it. And while public conversation still churns, the internal dynamics become heavier, slower, and more deliberate. And this is where the real strain begins, because maintaining alignment under strain requires constant reinforcement, and reinforcement requires consistency, and consistency becomes harder as pressure grows. And once cracks appear, even small ones, perception shifts quickly, because stability is not measured by strength alone, it is measured by continuity. And when continuity frays, the illusion of control weakens. And the moment that illusion weakens, attention sharpens. And attention is the most unforgiving force in this entire process, because it does not blink, it does not forgive, and it does not forget. And that is why the second phase of this story feels so different from the first, because the first was driven by reaction and response, while this phase is driven by survival and preservation. And preservation reshapes every motive, Because once survival becomes primary, truth becomes secondary, and strategy becomes defensive rather than expansive. And defensive strategy rarely creates new ground. It merely attempts to hold what remains. And holding ground in a shrinking environment requires sacrifices that few anticipate at the start. And those sacrifices come quietly at first, through narrowed communication, altered positioning, delayed responses, and calculated restraint. But each sacrifice also removes insulation. And once insulation is gone, exposure spreads faster and further. And this creates a feedback loop, where protection increases visibility, and visibility accelerates vulnerability, and vulnerability demands further protection. And so the cycle tightens inward rather than outward, and the space to maneuver contracts with each turn. And this is the moment where the external narrative begins to lag behind the internal reality. Because externally, the story still looks turbulent, loud, active, while internally, it becomes rigid, constrained, and increasingly brittle. And brittle systems do not shatter from the largest impacts. They shatter from accumulated microfractures that finally align. And these fractures form at the points where pressure meets denial, and where coordination meets fatigue, and where alignment meets conflicting interests. Because no alliance remains perfectly synchronized under sustained stress. And once divergence begins, even subtle divergence, momentum becomes uneven, and uneven momentum destabilizes structure. And structure destabilization always precedes visible collapse. And that is what makes this phase so critical, because collapse rarely announces itself. It reveals itself only after it has already occurred internally, and the outward signs come too late for reversal. And the further this moves, the more irreversible it becomes, because reversibility depends on flexibility, and flexibility depends on options. And options diminish fastest when timing windows close. And timing windows in this situation have been closing quietly, one after another, without dramatic language, without spectacle, and without alarm. But each closure subtracts one more pathway to containment. And the loss of containment is what transforms conflict into consequence. Because once containment fails, spillover becomes unavoidable. And spillover drags in everything connected, whether directly or indirectly. And this is where alignment once again becomes the defining factor. Because what is bound together will be impacted together. And disentangling at this point does not neutralize risk. It redistributes it. And redistribution under pressure often magnifies rather than reduces total exposure. And that is the paradox of late-stage strategy, where efforts to reduce individual vulnerability can increase collective liability. And once collective liability expands, it becomes visible to systems that operate on aggregation rather than narrative. And those systems respond not to claims, but to thresholds. And once a threshold is crossed, action becomes procedural rather than discretionary. And discretion is where outcomes can be negotiated, while procedure is where outcomes are executed. And the lean toward procedure is now unmistakable, because flexibility is no longer increasing, it is narrowing. And with each narrowing step, the ability to steer diminishes, and drift replaces control. And drift under pressure always trends toward lowest stability rather than highest resilience. And this is why the atmosphere feels heavier now, even when nothing new appears on the surface. Because the unseen mechanics are shifting under load, and those mechanics carry far more weight than any statement ever could. And this weight is what viewers sense as tension. Because tension is not noise. It is stored energy waiting for release. And stored energy does not dissipate through commentary. It releases only through resolution. And resolution in this environment does not arrive through debate. It arrives through outcome. And once outcome arrives, it reorganizes everything retroactively, turning speculation into history and strategy into record. And the closer this process moves toward that tipping point, the more each prior decision gains gravity, and the more difficult it becomes to reinterpret intent, because interpretation freezes when outcome solidifies. And that moment is approaching, whether acknowledged or not. And everything that follows now unfolds under that shadow. And that is what makes this segment of the story not just dramatic, but decisive. And this is the moment where the story stops being about headlines and starts being about outcomes. Because once the final doors close, there is no rewriting what comes next. The only question left is, who saw it coming? And who will be left trying to explain it after everything is already decided?